to reach the unreachable. I asked her to sing that song because to me I think we resonate with that and with the song Dave sang, Imagine, because there's something about who we are that knows things could be a different way. That in many, many cases, and I'm not saying that we don't appreciate and that we can't have peace where we are, because we need to. And we don't need to be complacent. We don't need to settle for less. We don't need to get so rocked in the lullaby of that's just the way it is, that we forget there's still a lot of injustice in our world. There's still a lot of spiritual potential yet to be realized. And I believe those songs speak to that, and something within us wants to jump up and say, yes, I know it's true, to reach and to be more. There's a wonderful story of a kindergarten class, and the teacher said, it's art time now. Go get your crayons or pencils and whatever you want and sit down and draw a picture. And one little girl beat everyone. She dashed over and picked out some coloring crayons and went and sat down and was feverishly, head-focused, totally consumed drawing. The teacher made her way over and said, tell me about your picture. She said, I'm drawing God. And the teacher said, well, I don't think you can do that. No one knows what God looks like. She said, they will in a few minutes. And I like that because, no one does know what this one power and one presence can look like. But I believe every day in many different ways it's being drawn out of us, that we're being asked to color outside the lines, to trespass the self-imposed boundaries of our own being. Did you hear that? To trespass the self-imposed boundaries of our own being so that we may explore and become more of who and all and what that we are. And so today, as we talk about this for a bit, I want to introduce you to an acronym that I hope you will remember, and it is LGBBE. Would you say that? It's 5? LGBBE. One more time. LGBBE. What that stands for is Let God Be Big Enough. Let God be big enough. And I like to do that with my fingers, because do you ever find yourself clenching the steering wheel when you're in traffic, or just gripped, or you feel yourself really tense? Well, those are the opportunities to just take that deep breath and say it with me. Let God be big enough. Let God be big enough. In and through and as us. Mary Oliver was one of my favorite writers, and she said, I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. There's one saying that a person said, I want to come to the end of my life so that the mortician cannot wipe that smile off of my face, that I have said, I've been here and I've enjoyed it. I've been able to fully show up. That I don't want to just simply have visited this world. So when we think about that, we also think about everyday life. And how many of you are aware that you complain? Okay, now don't point to your partner. How many are you aware that you complain? We're good at pointing out other people's faults. How many of you, does anyone complain this morning? 3 of you. Okay, get really honest. Anybody complained this morning? that it's, it's part of our nature sometimes to complain. But there's a gift there that if we will listen to our complaints, if we pay attention to our concerns, there's an opportunity for us to let God be big enough. That our complaints are telling us something about ourselves. And there's a quote that says, within every complaint is the seed of an intention. If we start to really listen to our complaints, that within every complaint is the seed of an intention. Because we are here as co-operators with this one life presence. And the great Eric Butterworth said, God can do no more for you than God can do through you. I think sometimes we wait for this divine unseen presence to just drop down on the earth and show up and take over and do something. Well, people have been waiting for that for many thousands of years. I think it's time, as the Native Americans said, that we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And that in no way diminishes God, but what it does is it calls us into the fullness of our God beingness, that who we are is to show up and to let God be big enough in my consciousness, in my awareness, in my capacity and willingness to show up. You know, most roadblocks in life, you know where they exist? In our head and in our heart. That whatever the obstacle is, and I'm not saying that life doesn't have obstacles, because it does, but what tends to get us stuck is the roadblocks in our own head, in our own heart. And that we can get stuck in our excuses. We can get stuck in a difficult past. We can get stuck in a difficult present situation. And those are the places where we are called to let God be big enough. You know, if we look back on our history as a nation, when we were part of England many years ago, and the founders of this country said, we're tired of being oppressed. We're tired of not having a voice for our own say-so, that we want to do what we want to do. We want freedom. And they were willing to risk that. They were holding on to an idea that did not yet exist. But they held a vision. They held a vision inside so strong for that possibility that it enabled them to step out. And today, we experience freedom in many, many different ways that so many of us take for granted just because they had a complaint. But they didn't let that complaint keep them stuck. They let that complaint boil into an intention with a vision that called something forth. There's a young girl. You may have heard the story of Malala. How many of you have heard about the young Pakistani girl at 14 years old, growing up in Pakistan where the Taliban refuses to let young girls learn to read or any education? Well, her father was an educated man, and she wanted to read, so she went to school. She got other little kids in her neighborhood to go to school. And the Taliban at night would literally call out the name on a speaker of people that were on their hit list. And they literally called out her name. And the people in the village said, surely the Taliban will not harm a child. But as she was coming home from school the next day, the Taliban shot her in the face, almost killed her. She was airlifted out, taken to another country, and through a number of surgeries and some generosity, she reclaimed her health, but refused to let it hold her down. She's the youngest person in history to win a Nobel Peace Prize. She's now raising hundreds of thousands of dollars, starting school all around the world for girls and boys, wherever they are. And her message is, we need books, not bullets. That there's an idea whose time has come is like, what if we invested in education? What if we invested in our true potential rather than in bullets? And so it is with us that when it's time for an idea to be born, Reverend Searcy says, when it is time for an idea to be born, the idea will find a clear channel. Someone who cannot turn away from the truth it carries. You know, we've read throughout history people fighting about who had the idea first. Because when an idea is ready to be born, people can catch that idea and bring that idea to birth. How many of you know you have divine ideas? You see, it's not a matter of do you have them. You have them. The question is, are we paying attention to them? I want to look at a character for a few minutes that in Unity we draw from a lot of different sacred texts, many different faith traditions. Today I want to look at the Bible. And in Unity, we look at the Bible for its metaphysical, meta, M-E-T-A, meaning beyond. So rather than the literal meaning, we're looking for that deeper, like when Jesus told parables, if he said the kingdom of heaven is like a bunch of leaven that you put in flour, that carried a message of truth that transcended the time. So in the Bible, the whole Bible is really a story about moving from Adam consciousness, a consciousness of one who believes they are separate, to Christ consciousness, what Jesus embodied and told us we were the same thing to do. So the characters and the stories are here to awaken things within us. The character Moses, if you look at the word Moses, what the word Moses means is to draw out. Now that's an interesting meaning for his name, because if you know the story of Moses, Moses was born in Egypt in a time where the children of Israel were being oppressed. There was a time in the time of Jacob, who was called Israel, that the Hebrew people were welcomed and invited guests because they needed something from them. They were welcomed and invited to come into the land of Egypt. And what happened, the Hebrew people began to multiply and flourish. They began to penetrate every area of the Egyptian culture. The Egyptians didn't like it. They were feeling threatened because this host country, the Egyptians, were just about to be outnumbered from these guests that they had been invited in. So they started oppressing them. And the Pharaoh sent out this edict and said, every baby boy born to a Hebrew will be drowned in the Nile River. And that's in the Bible. It's a horrible story. But every boy was supposed to be drowned so they could stop the propagation. So when Moses was born, his mother was a Hebrew woman. She was not about to drown her baby boy in the river. So instead, she got an idea. She put him in a basket. And the story says that she sent the little baby Moses off in a basket as she hid in the bushes. And Moses had a bigger sister named Miriam. And Miriam walked down along the bank, sort of hiding, just to see where Moses was going. And as the story goes, Moses went a little way, and then there was a woman bathing in the water. The woman saw the baby. That woman wanted a baby. This was an Egyptian woman who happened to be the daughter of the Pharaoh who had issued that edict. This woman scooped up the baby and said, I'm going to take this baby home to be my own. It's a newborn baby. But there was a problem. She couldn't nurse the baby, so she said, I need a nursemaid. And this little girl, the sister who had been walking along, said, my mom had a baby that she had to let go. My mom is a Hebrew woman. She can be the nursemaid. And so the woman never knew, but the nursemaid that came in that actually nursed Moses and took care of him was really his mother in hiding. And so Moses grew up as an Egyptian. He was a prince. He identified with the Egyptian people as a prince, but he loved this woman who had been his nursemaid and taken care of him. And as Moses got old enough, she told him one day, she told him the story about, I gave birth to you, and I had to put you in the water to save your life. I had to let you go, and it broke his heart because he identified as an Egyptian Pharaoh, and now he realized that he was really a Hebrew. He was really one of the oppressed people. And the story takes place now in Exodus 2, and it says, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews. He saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of the fellow Hebrews. He looked to the right and he looked to the left, and after making sure no one was coming, he was so incensed that he killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. As the story goes on, the next day Moses was going about his business, and somebody said, well, are you going to kill me like you killed the man yesterday? And Moses thought, oh Lord, I didn't know anybody saw me. I better get out of town. And so he ran. The story says he goes up into the hills, he hides, he's afraid for his life, and he becomes a shepherd. He's just taking care of sheep. Now, I want to pause for a moment before I finish the story, because you're probably thinking, okay, what does that have to do with me? Well, remember I said Moses represents that which is within us that is always drawing out our divine nature. It's always calling us to bring forth our divine potential. The first thing that Moses did when he has a complaint, there's an obstacle in front of it, he rages against it. He takes things into his own hands. He kills a person. He takes things into his own hands, raging against something. Have you ever been so angry you raged against something, that you find yourself in a battle against something? And you know what happens if you take things in your own hands, believing that you're where it is, you're the only power on earth. If you take things in your own hands, it's only going to create more problems, which is what happened in his life. He's found out. He takes things into his own hands. That didn't work. So he runs away. You see, when we face obstacles and challenges, those are the two things that we tend to do. We tend to rail against, we tend to engage and fight with the obstacle, which only usually creates more problems. Or we run away. I think in this culture, another way of saying we run away is to say we just dismiss it. Or we just say, oh well, que sera, sera. That's just the way it is. Things have been like this so long. I'm only one person. How can I possibly change things in the middle of the East? God help us, who only knows who's going to be our next president. What are we all going to do? Going, back and forth. We can get lost in that, in those complaints and that frustration, and either rail against it or we run away. Well, what happened in this situation is, as Moses, after he had run away, it says one day he was tending sheep and he discovered a bush, a burning bush that wasn't consumed, but the bush was on fire, which symbolizes when the whole spirit of life gets your attention. You ever had a cosmic 2x4 hit you in the head more than once? It's like, okay, I think I got the message. No, okay, this time I really got it. It's like it's raging right in front of you. You cannot miss it. And the message was, go set my people free. You go do something. You go do something. You had this complaint. You had this concern. You had this compassion. You tried to take it into your own hands. Then you run away, but it's not going to let you go. Go do something. And typically when all of us really feel that within us, we get excited and feel that go do something, the next thing we do is start saying, you must mean somebody else. You must mean somebody else, not me. Is there anybody else you're talking to? And as the story goes on, it took a while, but you've seen the movie. You've seen him played by Charles, who was it? Yeah, I always thought he should have been played by Martin Short because he really, he really was not, he was a wimp getting there. But it's like, we know about the sea parting and the people crossing and the 10 Commandments. We didn't hear that he buried a man in the sand after he killed him. That's never really talked about a whole lot. It's that we all have those skeletons in our past. But when those complaints and those concerns and those things come up, it's calling us to say, how do I need to let God be big enough? That maybe I'm making excuses. Maybe I'm caught up in this lullaby of saying, it's just such a big mess. I'm just going to mind my own business, do my little thing, and hope the world doesn't go to hell in a handbasket before I get out of Dodge. Unfortunately, a lot of people have honestly kind of come to that. And I really believe that there's a shaking in our world going on right now that says, hello, it's time to rise up. It's time to remember who you are, that you can't rail against things. Someone told me this week something funny. They said, can you imagine if you met someone from the 1920s and they came up to you and you pulled out your phone, your iPhone, and you said, look at this. Can you imagine that today I hold this in my hand? I can talk to people from around the world. I can access something called the World Wide Web. I can do all kinds of things with this little thing. The person in the 1920s, they couldn't imagine that was possible. And if they looked at you and they said, well, what do you do with it? And you said, I look at videos of funny animals and argue with strangers. It's sort of like our life, We are the greatest natural resource on earth, and we spend our time looking at funny videos and arguing with strangers. And it's like this world is saying, hello, wake up, that there's more to the party here. There's more that you can do. And so just as Moses, that represents being drawn out, there's something that is calling us out. As a spiritual community, I was drawn to come to Asheville very clearly. Many of you know my story. I'm from eastern North Carolina, loved it, grew up in the Pentecostal church, and that worked for me until it didn't. And then when I came out to who I was, and there was some ways I just wanted to go somewhere else. And as I went to ministerial school in Kansas City, I served a ministry in Kansas, and then I went to Maui, Hawaii, which was just fabulous, and then the Seattle, Washington area. Then I really began to be called back specifically to the Asheville, North Carolina area. And quite frankly, I'm just going to be real candid, there was a part of me that said, that may be too conservative for me today. But there was something in me that would not let me go. And it was specifically this area. And I had to pay attention because this something kept saying, it's you. I'm calling you, and I'm calling you to a specific church. And so those of you that know the story, you know how we arrived here together a little over a year ago. And this church had an amazing leader. And just like Moses, who led those children of Israel up to a point, he wasn't the one that carried them into the promised land. Why? Because it wasn't his to do. And so we don't get hung up in that. I don't get hung up in why am I here and why am I not. You know, some of us plant, some of us reap, some of us sow. But what I know to be true is that amazing man named Reverend Shadow Shade did some amazing work. And there's all kind of things that have been planted. And now all heaven is ready to break loose. People tell me, we have newcomers every Sunday almost that say, I don't know why I've been drawn to this area. How many of you have ever lived in Florida? Look around. I mean, it's like, there's no coincidence that you all wound up here. How many of you were born in another state? Wow. How many of you were born in this state? Yeah. Most of us left. But there's you know, this is a beautiful vortex of beautiful energy, of nature, and there's something taking place. And so as a spiritual community, over the past 12, 14 months, something has been happening. And we're now at a point where we're getting all things evolve in a spiral. I know that we're being called to break through to another level. And when a plant bursts through the earth, there's some pain, there's some growing pain involved, but that's okay. We've got the momentum going. And so now it's up to us. If you're here, you've been drawn here because you're here to say, you know what? I believe the world is suffering from a case of mistaken identity. I believe we all need to know who we are, and once we know who we are, I will honor who you are, and then and only then will we begin to have peace on earth. Amen? And so that's our message, and that's what we live, and that's what we share. It's that simple and that profound.